You are welcome once again to another study session of NSC 301, which is study session 5, and we discuss communicable diseases, its epidemiology, surveillance, and response. Please sit down and enjoy this lecture. Epidemiology developed from the study of outbreaks of communicable diseases and of the interaction between agents, hosts, vectors, and reservoirs. The ability to describe the circumstances that tend to spark epidemics in human populations has increased human ability to control the spread of communicable disease through surveillance, prevention, quarantine, and treatment. At the end of this study session, you should be able to define the basic concept of communicable diseases to include epidemics and endemics. You should be able to describe the chain of infection. You should be able to explain the investigation and control of epidemics, and you should be able to discuss surveillance and response strategies. Let's look at some key definitions like communicable diseases. A communicable or infectious disease is one caused by transmission of a specific pathogenic agent to a susceptible host. Infectious agents may be transmitted to humans either directly from other infected humans or animals or indirectly through vectors, airborne particles, or vehicles. Vectors. Vectors are insects or animals that carry the infectious agent from one person to person. Vehicles are contaminated objects or elements of the environment such as clothes, cutlery, water, milk, food, blood, plasma, parenteral solutions, or surgical instruments. We can also have contagious diseases, which are those that can be spread between humans without an intervening factor or vehicle. Contagious literally means touch. Moving to the burden of communicable diseases. Communicable diseases account for 14.2 million deaths each year. Another 3.3 million deaths are attributable to maternal and perinatal conditions and nutritional deficiencies. Together, these account for 30% of the world's deaths and 39% of the global burden of disability. 6 causes account for almost half of all premature deaths, mostly in children and young adults, and account for almost 80% of all deaths from infectious diseases, like acute respiratory infections, HIV/AIDS, diarrheal diseases, tuberculosis, malaria, measles. Communicable diseases pose an acute threat to individual health and have the potential to threaten collective human security. While low-income countries continue to deal with the problems of communicable diseases, deaths due to chronic diseases are rapidly increasing, especially in countries where we have proportionally less communicable disease mortality, and these countries still bear the cost of high morbidity from certain communicable diseases. Epidemic and endemic diseases. Epidemics are defined as the occurrence of cases in excess of what is normally expected in a community or region. When describing an epidemic, the time, period, geographical region, and particulars of the population in which the cases occur must be specified. Communicable diseases are termed endemic when they have a relatively stable pattern of occurrence in a given geographical area or population group at relatively high prevalence and incidence. The number of cases needed to define an epidemic varies according to the agent, the size, the type, and susceptibility of population exposed, and the time and place of occurrence. The identification of an epidemic also depends on the usual frequency of the disease in the area among the specified population during the same season of the year. A very small number of cases of a disease not previously recognized in an area but associated in time and place may be sufficient to constitute an epidemic. Vaccines, which is the most effective means of preventing infectious diseases, have been developed so far only for some viral and bacterial diseases. If the attempt to make a malaria vaccine is successful, this will be the first vaccine for a parasitic disease. Vaccines work on both an individual basis by preventing or attenuating clinical disease in a person exposed to the pathogen, and also on a population basis by affecting herd immunity. Let's look at the chain of infection. Communicable diseases occur as a result of the interaction between the infectious agents, the transmission process, the host, and the environment. The control of such diseases may involve changing one or more of these components, all of which are influenced by the environment. These diseases have a wide range of effects, varying from silent infection with no signs or symptoms to severe illness and death. The major thrust of communicable disease epidemiology is to clarify the processes of infection to develop, implement and evaluate appropriate control measures. Knowledge of each factor in a chain of infection may be required before effective intervention can take place. However, this is not always necessary. It may be possible to control a disease with only a limited knowledge of a specific chain of infection. The infectious agents. Infection is the entry and development or multiplication of an infectious agent in the host. Infection is not equivalent to disease, as some infections do not produce clinical disease. The specific characteristics of each agent are important in determining the nature of the infection, which is determined by such factors as the pathogenicity of the agent, which is the ability to produce disease, measured by the ratio of the number of persons developing clinical illness to the number exposed. Also, it can be determined by virulence, which is a measure of the severity of disease, which can vary from very low to very high. Once a virus has been attenuated in a laboratory and is of low virulence, it can be used for immunization, as with the case of poliomyelitis virus. It can also be determined by infective dose, which is the amount required to cause infection in susceptible subjects. Also, reservoir of an agent too is another factor, which is its natural habitat, which may include humans, animals, and environmental sources. The source of infection too is another factor, which is the person or object from which the host acquires the agent. Knowledge of both the reservoir and the source is necessary if effective control measures are to be developed. Investigation and control of epidemics. The purpose of investigating a communicable disease epidemic is to identify its cause and the best means to control it. This requires detailed and systematic epidemiological work in the following sequential or simultaneous steps. 1. Undertaking preliminary investigation. The initial stage of investigation should verify the diagnosis of suspected cases and confirm that an epidemic exists. The preliminary investigation also leads to the formulation of hypotheses about the source and spread of the disease, and this in turn may lead to immediate control measures. Another step is to identify and notify cases. The investigation of a suspected epidemic requires that new cases be systematically identified, and this means that what constitutes a case must be clearly defined. The cases reported early in an epidemic are often only a small proportion, the extent of the epidemic. Another step is collecting and analyzing data. The management of an epidemic involves treating the cases, preventing further spread of the diseases, and monitoring the effect of control measures. Treatment is straightforward, except in large-scale epidemics, for which external resources may be needed. You collect and analyze data, you manage and control, you disseminate findings, and carry out follow-up. Surveillance and response. Health surveillance is an ongoing systematic collection, analysis, and interpretation of health data essential for planning, implementing, and evaluating public health activities. Surveillance needs to be linked to timely dissemination of the data so that effective action can be taken to prevent disease. Surveillance mechanisms include compulsory notification regarding specific diseases registries, continuous or repeated population surveys, and aggregate data that shows trend of consumption patterns and economic activities. Principles of surveillance. Looking at the principles of surveillance, a key principle is to include only conditions for which surveillance can effectively lead to prevention. Another important principle is that surveillance systems should reflect the overall disease burden of the community. Other criteria for selecting diseases include incidence and prevalence, indices of severity, mortality rate and premature mortality, an index of lost productivity, medical costs, preventability, epidemic potential, information gaps on new diseases. Surveillance relies upon a routine system of reporting suspected cases within the health system, followed by validation and confirmation. Active and appropriate responses ranging from local containment measures to investigation and containment by a highly specialized team are then put in place. Thank you for listening. Bye for now.